And now we're live. And now we're going live for MergePHP May 2023. All right. Okay. We're live. Yep. So slight change of plans tonight, guys. I think we're going to do some lightning talks. We've got 3 or 4 people here, volunteers, to talk about some different topics, and then we'll see where we're at. So it might be a little bit of a shorter meeting tonight, but yeah, I guess let's go through the intro slides, and we'll talk about a few things in the slides. It's always good to do that. So let me get the slides going. View. All right, share screen, PowerPoint. All right. So yeah, MergePHP. This is us. The list of groups. I think we'll go through the group stuff fairly quick, and a few exceptions here. And yeah, so first exception there is Atlanta PHP. Chris runs Atlanta PHP, and he does one of our giveaways. I don't know if we're going to have 2 giveaways this month, but Chris handles all the giveaways. And so the first person to email chris@atlantaphp.org will win a JetBrains license. And we always have at least 1 to give away, and sometimes multiple, thanks to Josh. So email Chris and you can get your JetBrains license. Boston PHP, and Bobby runs that, and Gene Bevan runs the virtual self-study group for Boston PHP. You can find more information about Boston PHP there on their meetup group. Austin PHP, that's me. Check us out there on Meetup and GitHub and a few other places. Seattle PHP there is on Meetup. Vancouver PHP on Meetup as well. Vegas PHP Programmers is on Meetup, run by Josh Copeland, and his company Remote Dev Force sponsors MergePHP. So thanks to Josh and his company for helping out. KC PHP, that's a few people. Eric is usually the main person there, so check them out on Meetup. Utah PHP is Mark, and they're on Meetup there. San Diego PHP has a conference happening next week, here soon. So I don't believe John or Eric will be joining us this month, but there should be, the discount code should still be active. And if you're close to Chicago at this point, you know it's probably too late to schedule a flight, but you know, definitely consider going to PHP Tech. And we always have the obligatory PHP support slide in here. So if you haven't upgraded to 8 or later, definitely consider upgrading as soon as possible, or move everything to containers. That's usually the answer, right? That solves all the problems. So yeah, PHP Tech is happening soon. And there are quite a number of PHP conferences happening this year. So if you live near any of these places, check these conferences out. You should be able to find them online. Yeah, and so this was a little bit out of order there. Sorry, I thought this was next to the Boston slide. So this is the virtual self-study group that's run by Gene Babin, and so this quarter here starting in a few days. They're doing intro to software development. So if you know anybody who's interested in learning programming or software development, it's a self-paced group. So it's they get together a few people and they learn collaboratively, and they do different, it's self-paced, but you have a little cohort of people working together to learn different topics, and they do one about once a quarter. So check them out there on the Boston PHP meetup site. And if you're watching this on YouTube, welcome. Please give us a like and subscribe. That definitely helps out the channel. And you can find this other places as well. So next month, Israel is going to be speaking about like moving from Symfony to Laravel and some lessons learned. So if you have any interest in the two main frameworks that most people know, and migrating from one framework to another, definitely join us next month for Israel's talk. And we're just trying to figure out, it may be an in-person talk that we stream, similar to the one that we did, I think it was last month or the month before, but we're still figuring out the details on that. So next month, check that out. Yes, and so if you're interested in speaking, it's the mphp.io/speakers, and it's pretty easy form there you can fill out to submit a talk. All right, so that is the end of intro slides. So who did we decide is going first?
I can jump in.
All right. I need to make you I need to make everybody, all our volunteers, co-hosts. All right. All right. Take it away, Mark, whenever you're ready.
Hey. We're going to jump right in. We're going to make this an abbreviated version of middleware with Mezio, which is a Laminias component. Let's go right into it. So with middleware, you have a request that comes in. It goes through different middleware layers with an application in the middle, and a response comes out of it. Typically, you have like an authorization or authentication layers, exception handling layers, auditing, logging, validation, filtering, those kind of layers sitting outside. And then finally an action within the application to go do whatever the API needs to do, the request needs to go do. Mezio is a Laminias item that has a component that has the ability to go do all these things. It's all PSR. There's different PSRs for the different middlewares, for implementation, for server, and the different components. You have middleware interface that has a request coming in, which has an immutable body, and the handler that's going to be called next, basically. And it returns out a response interface that's going to bubble back up out to the back end. For example, let's say your application uses API keys. You might have an API key check middleware layer sitting in there that the request comes in. You check for the API key. It might throw an exception if it's not found, or call off to some validation of the API key, and then it's going to call the handler to go do the next thing. The next thing might be going in, following that request to retrieve some data that the user, the object wanted. You have an application layer that sits at the end. It has a handle function, and it gets the request coming in and returns out the response. This is, if you're getting a user profile, for example, it's going to return that profile information. It's going to be that last item. I've often called these actions, or a handler of some sort that will just call off to the main layer logic within your application, calling it your business logic or organization, whatever it might be. There's a pretty typical flow with middleware. allowing for separation of different services. So now you have your very defined, layer with authentication that's going to use one thing and one thing only, following the solid principles. Finally, get to the middleware is going to do things. For example, another one is sending an email. You might get a request come in, it sends an email, returns back this response object that implements the response interface. Might be an example of another handler. With Laminias, Zend, there's a couple ways to configure the routes. Laminias is known for array configuration, or configuration, I should say, as a whole. So many of the components and objects are configurable. So either with array or object-oriented notation. So you might have an app that has a post, it has the API route, and then it has the different middleware layers available. So, for example, if you have something to figure out the change of something, for purchases, you have a change generator filter and an action. So it's filtering to make sure that the required parameters are there, and then an action to go and actually do what it needs to do. In this case, it's figuring out what change is needed. If you give money, it's going to tell you how much money to get back. You can chain these typically. So there's the post, and this is the different way of doing it. Purchase arrays. Going and implementing that. Slim has something similar, Laravel as well. Many of the frameworks have those kind of things. We'll skip through a bunch of these. Just wanted to touch on the PSR7. Just to be aware that it has these different like headers and giving the body, the protocol versions and so on. It can be super helpful with figuring out what to do. And with Laminias, at least, you can attach on some extra data to send along down as you go. So for example, if you authenticate a user, you can attach on some extra information about that user, so lower layers within the middleware can have access to that. We'll keep it pretty brief. We'll end it there, and hope that's a good quick introduction there.
Great. Great job, Mark. Appreciate the talk. All right, so I guess I'll go next. I'm going to talk about deploying with Cloud Run. All right, so I do not have slides ready, so we're just going to look at the documentation, because I think that, who doesn't love looking at documentation? Let's run through this real quick. So basically, you want to set up the Google CLI on your local machine and run, gcloud init, and that will prompt you to log into Google. It opens up a browser, then you just log into your Google account there normally. And Google works a little bit differently than AWS. It's all separated out into different projects. And you can think of a project similar to an AWS account, like an entire account. So everything is sandboxed inside a project, and you don't really talk to each other unless you configure it to allow them to talk to each other. So you just want to make sure that you specify what project you want to use, so you don't deploy things to the wrong project. That would be bad. And here's just a sample application, it's like a hello world example here. Everybody should be able to put this together. And then the Docker file is just like a basic Docker file here that uses Apache, the PHP, and then it uses it copies in the code here. It copies in this file that you created, the index hello world stuff there. So you don't really need to know all of this. If you have an existing Docker file and are familiar with Docker and how to get that set up, then you can certainly use something else. This is just like sample code. It is doing some INI work here writing out to this Cloud Run INI file, and that's changing how PHP is going to work inside of Cloud Run. And that's all that is doing. And this is just setting up ports for Apache to listen to, just doing some configuration work there as well. And then, setting up an INI there. And that's about it. The Docker ignore is you just have to set up a few things that so you don't like commit this into your container. I believe this will get built. I don't know why a vendor isn't included. That's a bit weird, but maybe yeah, I would have to run through this to see exactly what they're doing, but yeah, that's the Docker ignore is ignoring this from the container. All right, so you have your container ready, and you're able to deploy here just with this simple command, gcloud run deploy, and that will, it prompts you for a few things. You get source code location. Since you're currently in the current folder, you hit enter, and then a name for the service. This is going to be like the service that it sets up in. It'll give you like a Cloud Run URL, and so that this service name will be in the URL. And then then it's going to publish the container image to the artifact registry. So Google is a bit strange in that they have the Google container registry, but they also have the artifact registry. And artifact registry gets you security scanning, and they've got some additional features in the artifact registry. But the GCR, the Google container repository, still works. But it looks like by default they want to use the artifact registry. And the region, it may prompt you for a region. You might be able to skip this step depending on your local configuration. I don't know what this. This I guess is like letting anyone opening up requests from anywhere is probably what that is. And then that's it. That you'll get a deploy URL with your code. So like, if you're not familiar with like what is Cloud Run, right? Like what is Cloud Run? There's a thing over here. It tells you more about it, and there's some videos and lots of other stuff to read. But basically the difference. Cloud Run is a serverless platform. It's similar to Lambda if you've used Lambdas before. One major difference between Cloud Run and Lambda is that, as you just saw, it supports Docker containers. So you can build and deploy, Docker containers in any framework or language, directly to the GCP infrastructure, and it will auto scale, and you don't have to worry about it. And so it will scale with your pocketbook, as I like to say. Is the pricing model is pretty similar. I don't know, I'd have to go into the details on the differences. There is a free tier. I don't know if it's as good as the Lambda free tier, which I think gives you like 1 million free a month or something. I'd have to look into that, but definitely check out Cloud Run and Google services. I've been learning a lot about the GCP offerings, and it's a fun platform to learn. So check out GCP if you get the chance. All right, there's my lightning talk. Who wants to go next?
I'll go ahead.
Oh,
Sorry, go ahead. I'll
go for it, Ian. if you want.
All right. Give me 1 second here and I'll pull up slides and stuff. And that's yeah. All right, give me 1 moment and I will. All right. I guess we'll have to stick with that for a second. So I just threw slides link in the chat in case folks want to follow along, because I have a few links in this presentation. This is a rough preview of what I'll be giving at Tech next week, and it'll be a little bit smoother presentation when we do that. So this talk was based on me actually reading the Roy Fielding dissertation, and it's like, okay, what exactly is the whole like seminal REST dissertation about? And it turns out that there's a fair amount of it that when people are talking about prescriptive ways of building APIs, yes, those may be good ideas, but the dissertation tends to not touch on that. It tends to focus on like, okay, how do we build for the web? How do we build for going back and forth over HTTP in a way that is efficient for both the technical aspects as well as the kind of developer productivity aspects. So we'll cover kind of what's in the paper, hit the high points, and then go through a few different API patterns of like, hey, if you're designing an API starting from scratch right now, keep these things in mind to make sure that the developers that you're working with on the consuming end don't freak out because your API is doing some weird things. So this REST paper was, again, by Roy Fielding, and it is an architectural style. It doesn't get into implementation details. It goes for principles rather than specifics. But it is a set of constraints such that it's like, hey, don't just build your API any old way, build it on purpose, and keep these things in mind as you're doing so. So there's the first constraint here is that it's client server. It doesn't go into the nitty-gritty details of protocols, and that is intentional. You don't want something like, say, gRPC goes down to kind of wire format level stuff. Instead, we're staying at more of a high level abstraction so that whatever language you program in, you can, whether that is client or server, you don't have to use a specific language or specific framework in order to handle a given payload. As an example, you've got your standard HTTP request here. If you wanted to get tacos, then you just, well, get tacos. And you pass HTTP request headers to the server and get HTTP request headers back along with a response body. Second constraint here is that we're talking about something stateless, not keeping session there would be no need to keep session information on where somebody is in this choose your own adventure. Each request should be basically independent of the previous one. And the nice thing about that is that allows for scalability because you might be bouncing things across different web tier load balancers, and you're basically not having to rely on a long-lived connection or a long-lived session state to figure out where you were in the process. Each request is atomic, and whatever request you make, you get the response back and you're done with that transaction. This means that if you're designing an API such that it's like, hey, you need to request this thing and then this other thing and then this other thing and this other thing, and if you miss one of those requests, then the entire flow is broken, you probably need to sit down and rethink whether you can call that thing RESTful. And I do show here that, yeah, cookies are an anti-pattern, specifically where a cookie is referring to some state server side. Like browser side, yeah, you're probably going to be shoving maybe a bearer token or something like that in the cookie so that you're not having to re-implement authentication APIs in browser side. But more and more, as you're working with kind of single page apps and that sort of thing, you just throw a bearer token in the header and move on. As noted here, WebSockets where there's a long-lived connection with a single server or something that looks like a single server, that's not REST, but they also, right, WebSockets are solving a different problem. Same thing with gRPC. If you have a stateful protocol, like that's fine, just realize that you're giving up certain things that the constraints of REST guarantees you. Now, the thing with REST is that you have these constraints due to the way the internet and specifically the web and specifically HTTP works, where if you lean into that, then you get things like cacheability and kind of some performance increases versus having an API that doesn't conform to these constraints. If you have cacheability, then your system is going to be faster than if you don't. And if you build your resources such that they're kind of orthogonal to where if you make a change anywhere in the application, then the resource doesn't necessarily change, then that means that it sticks around, which gets into kind of this idea of large grain data objects where, yes, you might need only 3 or 4 fields out of 10 when you are handing an API response back. But in return, if some other piece of your application only needs 3 or 4 fields and some other piece of your application also needs some 3 or 4 other fields, then you've already requested the payload once. You can now serve it from cache rather than having 3 different requests for the same payload. Now, GraphQL behaves completely differently in this regard, where you request only what you need. But that means that the chances of actually being able to serve something from cache are much lower. So it's a trade-off there. Which, again, we keep talking about caching. That is an important part of RESTful API design, where if you want to shave down payload sizes and that sort of thing, go right ahead, but realize that if you shave things down too much, then you wind up having to make multiple requests for the same thing. And requests are relatively expensive. Serving a few hundred K of something from a cache is going to, if that cache is a millisecond or 2 away from you, maybe that's on disk, maybe that's your local database, maybe that's Redis, that is going to take less time than going out to a network request, which might actually have to hit your origin server, might hit a CDN, who knows, recalculating a response body and then getting that back to you. That might take 100 milliseconds. It's like, well, but if I do that, then I save 50K of payload size. It's like, yes, but your 50K of payload size is stored locally and storage is cheap. So HTTP has built into it methods for indicating kind of cache control. The HTTP status code 304 says, hey, the thing that you requested from me, you already have the latest version. You said, hey, I have the latest version of your HTTP request. There are a couple of different headers that you can use for that. And it can respond and say, okay, yeah, you already have the latest version. I'm not going to send it back to you. There's no need. I'm not going to send you another, couple hundred K over the wire. You've got what you need. And we're good. And HTTP cache control uses things like e-tags, where it says, this is a representation of this resource. Maybe that's a hash, maybe that's some other sort of identifier. And if you provide that e-tag back, then the server can tell, oh, the client already has the latest representation, or the client doesn't have the latest representation. Here's a new one. You use these headers, if modified since, if none match, or vary, to do this cache control. Vary indicates kind of which headers are used to kind of compute your cache key, because you might have the same resource being requested, but due to something like geolocation or device type or one of a number of other constraints, the same resource may respond differently and may need a different cache key. So for example, if you vary based on content type, let's say it's a HAL response in JSON versus some other JSON hypermedia format. Those will have different responses, even though it's representing the same resource, which means that they should be cached separately, because otherwise you're serving the wrong thing from your cache. Now, these constraints are coming from a kind of confluence of software design and network protocols. If you just look at software design, then you're going to make optimizations assuming that you have an infinitely fast network that has zero latency. I don't know if you've been in an area with crappy Wi-Fi or cell reception, but we don't live in an era with infinite network capacity with zero latency. Even if you do, then some other user of the system in a different city than you won't be. You're not just serving things from your local or your home network. Now, by contrast, you can optimize the heck out of things for the network side, but if that makes consuming it from a client side, once you get that payload, excessively difficult from a developer's perspective, then you've just traded off CPU cycles or network traffic, which are relatively cheap, for developer productivity, which is, well, rather expensive. So next constraint here is that of a uniform interface. The idea here is that you're operating over a network in a distributed form. And you build your APIs out with the assumption that they are accessed over a network, potentially through multiple layers of proxies, whether those proxies are something like a CDN or something like at the application tier between the outside internet, say it's a load balancer or something to that effect, or maybe it is some aggregation layer like an API gateway. That means that you're going to make different decisions than if you were serving things over a LAN or between resources on the same machine. So one of the kind of interesting things about a uniform interface is these, non-uniform interfaces, because there are multiple standards for it, but hypermedia as the engine of application state. Or to make things, bring it down to a level that more folks understand, links. Basically, being able to discover what you can do with a system by looking at the responses that system gives you. So when you're serving HTML up, that's in the form of like forms and buttons and URLs that have or text that has a little line under them, or usually it's just highlighted in a different color now, notably links. If you traverse an entire page via web scraping and look for all of your href anchor elements, those are all links. Those say, here's where you can go from this page. And you can go to that page via an HTTP GET request. The same thing can happen in APIs. you give a response back and then say, hey, here are the things that you can do with this resource. You can cancel it in order, or you can delete an order, or you can move it to the next stage, and here's how you do that. Versus forcing the developer to read documentation and implement a client library, or use your SDK and hope that their autocomplete is good enough in order to figure out what you can do with from a given location. Now, again, there are multiple standards for this. You've got a number of things like HAL or JSON API, which just look at the representations of resources on the get side. You have Siren or Cephal that allow you to specify, here are the actions that you can perform on a given resource. For example, submitting an order or revising a user's profile information. Whereas HAL is just like, hey, here are the links from this resource to other things that are related. Of course, that means that HAL is simpler and Cephal or Siren are more complex. But the idea here is, if you document your API well enough using these machine readable formats that are also reasonably human readable, then you can build an API client that just traverses responses, and you can build an API client that is pretty generic and can be plugged into any API. So, and the idea here is that another idea is that representations of resources are separate than the resources themselves. As an example, a WebP formatted image or a JPEG formatted image, same image, but it's different bits across the wire. For hypermedia formats, you might be able to serve a Siren formatted document or JSON API or HAL, representing the same resources, but having different metadata around it. Using a more kind of complex example, when you're, say, enrolling a device in multi-factor authentication via TOTP, there may be different ways of representing that TOTP enrollment code. One would be a QR code where it gives you back the image as a ping, and then you scan that QR code and that enrolls the device. Or you could have the URL in text that image encodes. Now, this is another thing that is built into HTTP via content type negotiation. Your browser, when it hits URL, in that HTTP request, it says, hey, I accept HTML text or XML or what have you. Or when it's requesting an image, it can say, hey, I support both the JPEG image or a ping or whatever, but I also support WebP or HEIF or HEIC. And then the server can say, cool, I'll give you something in the format that you asked for. The accept header specifies from the browser which content types are accepted. And the content type header specifies either from the browser or from the client side what content type is being provided in a request body. For example, hey, I'm sending you JSON encoded data, or hey, I'm sending you URL encoded form data or multi-part data. And the content type header from the server specifies what type of data you're getting back. As an example, let's say you're posting, you're creating a TOTP token in OAuth land, or not in OAuth land, in MFA land. You get a response back, and that token comes back as a HAL JSON object. So it's got a little bit of HAL metadata on it, like underscore links to something else related to this token, and it includes a URI for enrolling a device. But you might instead say, hey, instead of giving me back the default representation, which you can specify on the server side that there is no default representation and you have to provide an accept header that's completely valid. It's like, hey, instead of giving me a JSON payload, instead, let's hand back the QR code image. I want an image ping, and there might be image/ping plus QR code or something like that. That's a valid way of specifying, like, hey, I want this specific representation, not just this specific data format. And in this case, our auth server says, sure, I'll give you a QR code, and it hands you back a ping, and then you scan that with your phone and you go on your merry way. But one thing that this auth service doesn't support is giving you an XML payload. So if you try to say, hey, give me, like, I want to set up an auth token and give it to me as XML, it's like, well, that's not enough information. I don't have that implemented. And says, hey, the server isn't wrong here. The client is. Here are the content type, or here is a HTTP 406. Ask me for a different content type. So another constraint here is a layered system. We want abstraction and encapsulation on such that each layer doesn't need to particularly rely on implementation details more than one layer away from it. And that means that there are certain things that are left up to the implementer to decide. As long as you're consistent about it, then you're fine. But REST is not actually a query language. Yes, you can specify hypermedia in there to say, hey, if you want to query by this, that, or the other thing, then here's how the URL parameters will look, or something like that. But the dissertation itself doesn't have any prescriptive behavior around that, much to maybe some people's chagrin. Now, GraphQL is a query language, and it's very prescriptive about how things look, which is fine. And for certain use cases, like say, New Relic has a GraphQL API that allows you to kind of build out results and make queries on their data. And there's certain use cases where GraphQL is the better solution versus just a bunch of REST endpoints. If somebody says you have a RESTful GraphQL API, they don't know what they're talking about. And REST expects caches to be between client and server, whether that's a CDN or whether that is a browser cache. The design of REST is, there are some trade-offs that are made in favor of having the representation of a resource closer to you than that origin server, so that all of that effort of recalculating that response doesn't need to be made. And maybe you're able to serve that response from, say, Houston or Dallas, if you're in Austin, rather than going all the way back to US East 1 or wherever your actual origin server is. Now, here's an interesting constraint that doesn't get implemented a whole lot, except for when it does, when you download a single page app from a website and use that to interact with the website. And that is the idea of code on demand, where you get a resource back and it says, all right, here is in whatever client that we expect you're using, here's some code to actually operate on this resource. Again, this seems like this foreign concept until you realize that any web application is, well, basically this. It just happens that the code on demand is JavaScript or sometimes WebAssembly. One thing that is not JS that I've never seen implemented, and the library is no longer, well, the URL is even gone for this, but there was a project called Sensio Melody, where you could have a single file that specified both PHP code and composer dependencies that that code required. And you could pipe that file into Sensio Melody, and it would actually run things. So you could actually build a PHP SDK saying, hey, if you want to retrieve this resource or do something useful with it, here's some code that you can either copy and paste or directly run in order to do those interactions, basically delivering your SDK along with the data. Now, to summarize here, we've got a few constraints of REST: client server, stateless, cacheable, uniform interface, layered system, and code on demand. And yeah, code on demand is optional, and other than single page apps, it tends not to be implemented. And people don't realize they're even implementing code on demand in those cases. With that, this is not really been a lightning talk. So I figure I will pause here to ensure that other people can do talks and to save the more opinionated, less rest dissertation part of my talk for PHP Tech next week. With that said, if you want to see the rest of the slides, I did link this in the YouTube chat, and I believe Tech will have recordings of the more polished version of this talk available after I present it.
Awesome. Thanks, Ian.
Yep.
Yep. So Josh, I think is next.
Cool. So this is definitely impromptu. I don't have any slides or anything, but gonna share kind of how my development cycle has changed recently with the advent of AI taking over certain parts of my day-to-day. Let me share my screen. Sorry, just trying to find Zoom here. There it is. All right. So two things I want to share real quick about what I've been doing recently as far as leveraging AI to help make me a more productive programmer. One of the tools I've recently started using, and I'm sure people have heard of, is GitHub CoPilot. What's cool about GitHub CoPilot essentially is it is a paid product. That's a sucky part. I hear there's open source ways of kind of doing this, but anyway, I pay this. It's well worth the $10 a month. And essentially this will give you a little token that you can use as like an API key of sorts in your favorite IDE, such as JetBrains, my favorite, IntelliJ, or PHP Storm, whatever you use. You'll be able to find in the extensions a GitHub Copilot extension that you can install. I believe under, let's see, plugins here, there's my GitHub Copilot installed, and then you just give it your API key that you get from there, and then from there you have this little guy that sits here. You can disable it if you don't want it to provide you recommendations. But essentially, what you can do is, based on the code that you're in, GitHub Copilot basically is reading this code to determine your variable names and tries to predict what you're trying to code. So, for example, here I've got this open source project that I built called Phobos. It's just a bunch of Terraform and a PHP app that shows how to use like GitHub Actions to deploy an app into AWS ECS. In here, I'm just going to give some examples of kind of how GitHub Copilot works. So let me just zoom in a bit too. So maybe the, let's see, under view, or is it presentation mode, right? All right. So for example, you can see it's already kind of trying to give me some examples here. It's like, hey, do you want ASG? But essentially how I use GitHub Copilot, how I'd recommend using it is, let's say I wanted to write an API gateway here in my Terraform. I could say API gateway gateway for ECS. There we go. And then underneath here, it will start to auto-generate Terraform snippets for me. And I can hit tab on my keyboard to accept that snippet. If I didn't want to accept that one, there is a way to iterate through them too. Let me double check what typically the first one is always the one I go with, but there is a way to actually iterate through these as well. Let me find here. What's the, there we go. So here's all the IDEs that GitHub Copilot can plug into. So pretty much whatever you're using probably has a GitHub Copilot plugin you can install. Here we go. So depending on what OS you're on, I'm on Mac, so this would be option bracket. And you can go back and forth through suggestions. So that would, let's go back to my IDE here. So if I want to iterate through the next one, I could do, oops. So resource, so I'll do option, I don't know why it's not working. Oh, no more Copilot suggestions available. Okay, so it just has this one snippet for me because it's like this is pretty much what you want, an API gateway. If there were multiple things it thought it could suggest to me, you could iterate through them. And this has been pretty sweet just because a lot of things that you know have coded before, but you don't remember off the top of your head, and you have to end up going to Stack Overflow and the whole copy and paste kind of deal. This has completely cut all of that out for me. So this works in pretty much all of the languages out there, you know, so whether you're using PHP or whatever. From my understanding, I think the way that GitHub Copilot is working is not only through OpenAI and their models, but also through all of the open source code that GitHub actually has hosted. So it's kind of pulling from this knowledge database of, if you will, of all the code that's sitting out there in the GitHub sphere, and probably other spheres too, now that Microsoft owns it. I wouldn't be surprised if somehow Azure is getting pulled into that. But instead of like a Terraform example, let me just kind of pull up a snippet of PHP here and give some more examples. So let's say on the user here, we wanted to add their address. I would put address, and then you can see, boom, it's already saying public string address, and I just need to hit tab, and that's it. And it kind of, you know, again, it will give me other recommendations as I go through here. I could, you know, skip these or whatever, but essentially that's, I like to write a comment of what I need. So for example, now that I've got my address, I could say set address, and then underneath here, it automatically gives me a set address method. I just need to hit tab. So the days of having to type over and over are kind of slowly slipping away with that. So that's pretty cool. The other tool I've been using recently is ChatGPT. I also pay for this because it is well worth it. ChatGPT, when you first load it up, when you go to chat.openai.com, it's $20 a month for the paid version. There is a free tier if you want to try it out first. But it's essentially, instead of Googling stuff, now I go to ChatGPT first. It basically is like Google on steroids. Now, asterisk, it's not always correct. However, it's 90% correct most of the time, or can give you ideas into doing things in a different way. So for example, I typically select GPT-4, which is the latest version that just came out. It is a little slower than what 3.5 is, but GPT-4 is definitely more precise in its answers. So I don't mind waiting for something like that. So if I can think of an example here, let's say give me a doctrine ORM entity that or let's try to make it a little more complicated. Entities that will handle a user and entity and a connection to an address entity. So just kind of given a random thing I can think of here. But it then starts to talk to you like almost like a person, and we'll start to give you the code. So ChatGPT is just kind of spitting out the user entity here. Again, the reason why they say ChatGPT v4 is a little slower is you can see it's not instantaneous in its answer. It actually has to kind of churn through answering it to you. Whereas 3.5 is a little bit more like spits it out a lot quicker. But like I said, I don't mind waiting for a more precise answer than a fast answer. What is really cool, what I just created here is a context. So I created a new chat context. When you start a new chat context, ChatGPT remembers your conversation with them. So for example, I was talking to ChatGPT about like grading Pokemon cards and stuff, and I was kind of going back and forth with it. Or giving me ideas on how to motivate my kids to clean the house. Even talking about whether Symfony is better than Laravel, right? I kind of went back and forth with it. It gave me some snippets. It was kind of an interesting insight into what AI thinks about that whole debate. But yeah, so for example, let's say I get this user and address, and I'll wrap it up right after this. But you know, let's say I'm like maybe not 100% happy with this. Like if I look through this, you know, this is a many to one. So we've got a user, and then they can have multiple addresses. Let's say I only want them to have one address. So I could say, can you just make this a 1-to-1 relationship? Then it will basically redo its answer. So that's the whole idea of the context, is like as you're honing in on what you really want at the end of this. Where I found this very useful is, for example, I've been learning Azure pipelines and knew nothing about it. I've worked with pipelines before in GitHub, GitLab, but not in Azure. I kind of got lost at some points just looking through docs, and my eyes are going cross staring at Microsoft.com. I was just like, hey, let me try ChatGPT. Sure enough, it gave me some solid templates, if you will, to work from. Again, they were 90% of what I needed. Like even with GitHub CoPilot, right? Like this isn't a way for you to just auto-generate your way into a paycheck. Like you still need to check the code, know what the code is doing, and understand it. However, it is a way to boost productivity. So anyway, I guess I'll leave it at that. Unless if anybody has questions, I can check YouTube real quick if anybody does.
Have you tried any of the other tools? I think Amazon has one. And then obviously then there's a bunch of news this week about Bard.
Yeah, so I've tried Bard. I haven't tried an Amazon one. Bard was touted as being better for programmers because it was a little bit more native to giving you like larger files or whatnot. And I heard that then ChatGPT kind of combated that by adding more features for like like code. So Bard is great. However, it does kind of say it's going to go away and probably go to a paid product, just like ChatGPT will eventually in the future. Just a little history background, because I've seen a talk about this, that originally Google was like the king of AI. They've had Bard for quite some time. They've just kept it under lock and key. And they probably use it internally. And at one point they had like 50% of like all the world's AI developers or engineers, if you will. And some people didn't like that, all of the keys of the kingdom being under Google's umbrella. Elon was involved in that investment with them and eventually disagreed with Sergey about the ultimatum of AI and the singularity issue. And what if AI becomes sentient, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, Google was like, hey, we don't care. We want it to make the world a better place. Let's just let the thing loose. And Elon's like, no, we should kind of control it. So anyway, Elon helped start OpenAI. And there's obviously a bunch of other founders part of OpenAI as well.
He's no longer involved in it, though, to be anybody's not a big fan of his.
Yeah. Correct, because OpenAI kind of is now in the same boat of let's let this thing run rampant. And yeah, there's a disagreement again on that. So he's kind of again started his own thing. But yeah, I mean, maybe one day OpenAI might figure out a way to blow my computer up in front of me, but it hasn't happened so far. I hear if AI is going to ever do anything, it's just more on the lines of manipulating people, giving biased answers or suggesting things. So I'll try to, not take everything it says on face value, if a grain of salt, if you will. But I haven't really asked it too many hard-pressing questions other than if the Illuminati is real or not, which basically it said, no, it isn't. So that's your answer, which maybe it's a part of the Illuminati. That would probably be the answer.
Yeah.
Right. So
Right.
Anyway, thanks for
sounds suspicious. Cool. Yeah, I'm glad to see that more people are giving OpenAI a shot. And CoPilot is definitely powerful for sure. So as you said, it definitely helps boost productivity. So like, how do I do that thing again? And the older we get, it's like, there's only so much code you can fit in your brain. That's what the AI is for. It's like, remind me what I did last year. So
exactly.
Remind me what I had for breakfast.
That's right. Yeah. So I think we got one more talk. Chris, if you're still feeling like volunteering.
Yeah, sure. Well, talk a little bit high level about what I know about Laravel testing. I'm completely brand new to Laravel as of February, and I've been doing this testing stuff for just a couple weeks. So I'm going mostly on the docs and Laracast and whatever else I could find. Interestingly, the Laravel Dusk is the name of the package that's used for this, and or always one component. There's a couple of layers and levels of testing in Laravel. Dusk is primarily for like browser automation stuff. So if you've seen you're using anything like Cypress.io, very similar. Anything you can do in a browser, you can script and write assertions and so forth. All the interaction you can come up with, form interaction. Let's see what else. I'm trying to think. And what way this runs. Sorry, I'm kind of. This is totally impromptu as well. I haven't even thought of how to present on this yet. It's you can run it with. There's a Chrome driver that runs headlessly. That's a word. Or you can switch that off and make it visible. And I should also say all the Laravel stuff is kind of built on top of PHP unit. So there's things you can take advantage of there. These other Laravel based layers are a lot more kind of simplified, a lot more fluent, maybe easier to read than like raw PHP unit testing for the most part. And PHP unit doesn't natively do the browser automation kind of stuff like this. But as I said, you can do You can resize windows. You can work with authentication and cookies. You can execute and wait for JavaScript things. We're also working on Vue at my new job. So it's like there's things like wait for Vue component X, or wait for things to render, wait for things to load. You can pause if you need to in between steps in your script. So lots of different ways to do selectors. You can select with CSS selectors. You can also do things like, click, button named XYZ, like submit, or click, the button that's type of submit, and then it does things like that. So you can reference DOM elements multiple ways. There's even a Dusk tag where you add a Dusk equals submit button, and then you call it with an @ symbol @submit button. I've had some mixed experience with that working correctly, and I know it might be due to Vue rendering problems and things like that. We've got kind of a lot of nested components and things going on, so that may be part of the problem. But for the most part, that works pretty well. Think of what else to tell you about that real quick. Again, because it's browser based, you're going to have assertions regarding mostly like a lot of like form elements. It can do things. Also, browser level like assert that a port is actually, if you're using a different port or something, that's just one example of something I can think of. You can again work with cookies, assert that a cookie is present, assert, read the cookies and look at values. You can do all the form elements, assert, checked for a checkbox, assert radio for a radio button. You can type things into forms. One of the things I did recently was built out kind of, start with our login stuff. And so you write things like you have a browser object and you browse browser, and then you do arrow visit this path, and then you click link named this in text, and then you maybe you have to wait for a minute for something to load, or not literally a minute, but you do it in milliseconds. Sometimes it's half a second or whatever. Depends. You can append values in forms. You can trying to think through some of the things. So I said click through things and go through stages. And then work in authenticated or not authenticated situations, things like that. So that's been pretty interesting. Those are kind of slow, even headless. They're a little slow. You have a question, Logan, or something?
Yeah, I got the page up. There's like components. Do you want to run? Like, what is your recommended way to like learn about Dusk? Is the docs pretty good, or do you like Laracast better?
That's hard to say. The docs will get you started, certainly give you the context. The Laracast stuff on does it like there's a couple of courses I'm trying to remember now. There's a few testing courses that are a little bit dated, but they still apply. There's a small one on, I think it was a small one on just Dusk, if I remember correctly. What else? I know there's one on Pest, which I'll get to as a different part, another tool, different library. I don't know. I've found it's like a lot of times Laracast doesn't have quite exactly what I'm looking for. Another good testing reference is not Dusk specific. Although there's some Dusk stuff. Is Laravel Daily has a YouTube channel, and he's got a lot of free information there. I saw some references to paid courses, but then I found the whole course for free on YouTube. So I'm not sure if it went free or it's become paid, but it's still on YouTube. So look for that if you're interested. But let me see, trying to not run too long here. It's the other important thing I learned the hard way. The other thing is if you need to work with a database, there's a trait you can use for like running your migrations, like building up a whole test database and so forth. You need to be very, very careful. I learned this the hard way. It took a while to figure out. I was misusing a PHP artisan command. You run Dusk as PHP artisan Dusk, and if you just do Dusk, it runs all the tests you have, browser tests, feature tests, whatever else you got, or you can pinpoint a certain fault directory or just a single test. If you run that with a Dusk, PHP artisan Dusk and a test, what you can do is set up a different env file that's specific to your Dusk settings or environment. So you can set up separate database connections, use a test database and so forth. And you can also do things like run or preserve the migrations. So you don't have to do a whole teardown every single time you want to run. You can also exclude tables. So if maybe you want to tear down some of it, but want to keep your user table or something like that, there's property area variables for that, things like that. I haven't quite gotten that perfected yet because it was just kind of a hurry up and get something usable so we can see if this is going to work and do what we need to do. But if you run that, so the big today I learned problem I had was if you accidentally run that with a test command, PHP artisan test and a test name, it doesn't do any of that environmental stuff. And it kept like dropping my migrations table and my user table and all this crazy stuff. So I was learning that the hard way. If you're going to be concerned about your database, run it with the Dusk command embedded, not the test command. So that was really frustrating to figure out and finally realize what to do with it, because I was having those database properties and things in there, and it's like, it's not working. It's still dropping tables. You're truncating tables. What's going on with this? So there's an accidental paste of a malformed command in there. The other level is we call what Laravel refers to as feature tests. Those are the Dusk is primarily browser tests. Feature testing is more HTTP based, or more for like JSON APIs and things like that. So things are more like you can work with and customize like request headers. Again, you can still deal with like cookies, authentication, session things, exception handling, stuff like that. But then those kind of assertions are going to be more like, post JSON, and then your assertions are going to be like, say, you've got a response object, post JSON to this path, and you formulate your payload or whatever you're posting, and then you can say things like, let me flip to it. I had one piece up on a tab. Assert status code 200 return, or assert status code 200, and this is all completely fluent, by the way, so you can just keep arrow parentheses assertions. Assert you got 200 and it returns a valid JSON object, or it could be a JSON fragment where you're just looking for a snippet, one or two properties or something in whatever response is, just to check partial responses or partial information, things like that. So trying to think of anything else about that. A lot, like I said, JSON stuff primarily for that. Things it'll also do, again, more browser and API level things, assertions for things, again, about cookies and like redirects and what else, header stuff, things like that. That's a little more API focused. And there's, I think, some validation kinds of assertions. I've kind of just gotten into some more of this. And then I guess one more thing to mention, I'm aware of and have not gotten into yet is what's PEST-PHP, PESTPHP.com. It's a kind of a layer, again, on top of PHP unit that's a little more like, I think Jest is similar, where you write, you have, tests like expect $value to be type int and not equal 4 or something like that. It's like, it's a more English language, more fluent approach to doing that. It kind of sits on top of PHP unit. So right now I'm just trying to figure out normal testing, and then I'll maybe look at this, down the road. So some other thing, it was like hey, big tip, don't forget, and I just lost track of what I was going to mention. But anyway,
I have a question. Maybe
Okay.
that'll stall your brain there a bit. So can you run the Laravel Dusk in parallel? Like if you have a bunch of front end testing to make it like speed it up, or is it all sequential?
You can run in parallel. Yeah. I think if I remember correctly, there's a package that I think is fairly common, if I remember correctly. I don't know where it's not. It was on the other testing page. Let me see. Yeah, Brainium/Paratest is the package name. Is a composer package, and you just pass a -- parallel param to your tests running, the our test command. So yeah, I haven't even gotten that far yet. I'm just getting the first handful of tests up and running, but definitely want to take advantage of all those things. I know there is one of the docs pages specifically mentions like CI/CD integration, so that's definitely a thing. And I think it even had mention of like it had some just snippets. It wasn't like, oh, here, just copy this and it works perfectly, but it was like, mentions like Travis CI, GitHub Actions, a couple other, here's Heroku CI, Travis, GitHub Actions. So there's available information on integration. And that's where the whole database setup and teardown and whether or not you want to deal with migrations and preserving tables and stuff, that'll be important. So you're not having to rebuild everything, every single run in your test suite, particularly in that CI case, because that could happen, several times a day. And like I said, the browser tests are what takes so long. Like a handful of simple browser tests that I have right now takes a minute to run, whereas the feature tests, which are just strictly API, are like sometimes tenths of a second. So that's a little more like PHP unit, where you can run a whole ton of them pretty quickly. But interestingly, much to my surprise, as a new Laravel person, unit testing in Laravel is really third-class citizen compared to these other ones, because so much is already built in Laravel for you. There's not, and if you're writing mostly Laravel without a lot of really custom PHP, you're not even using unit test. You're not testing units. You're testing larger scale features or other pieces in that's kind of already built into Laravel. Like I told somebody, I didn't, in this new job, I didn't write raw PHP for the first 3 weeks, and it was some I needed like a random number thing for something once. It's like it's all been Laravel code, Laravel syntax, Laravel structure, framework, all framework stuff, and that's tested. You don't test your own, you don't test a framework. So it'll be a long time before I do much unit testing, because we're not writing at that level of granularity yet. So that's the completely opposite of what I'm used to doing. Is unit, all drill it down the smallest chunk, test that. That's kind of doesn't exist in that context in Laravel like it might in something else or a non-framework kind of app. And maybe other frameworks are similar, but I don't have outside experience with too many other things like that. So that was just something different to kind of get your head around of higher level stuff. And it's more feature testing, integration testing, those kinds of things. The other thing is sometimes you'll see all the non-Laravel terms for things kind of get lumped into feature testing. It's unit testing, feature testing, browser testing. Laravel's got a little bit different vocabulary for things, which is fine. It's just something to, if you're diving into it new, be aware what you think of as unit testing. If unit testing is unit testing pretty much in Laravel, feature testing kind of encompasses a wider range of other testing, maybe integration testing, things like that. It's not, so strict a definition, but anyway, that's all I can think of off the cuff at the moment. But that's sort of been my recent nosedive into the testing realm of Laravel. So there you have it. Awesome.
Well, I'm happy to hear you're learning Laravel there and getting better at testing and everything. Dusk is pretty powerful. They try to make it easy, that's the whole Laravel's thing, is their shtick is, keep the developer happy, and kind of make it easy on the developer. So it's nice for them to include the front end testing there, and try to speed up that aspect of it. And pests, it definitely looks like a really interesting way to write tests as well. If anybody's interested in giving a talk on pests, I think that would be a great talk for next time. So please submit your talk on pest. It's mphp.io/speakers is the link to submit talks. And yeah, is there anybody have any questions in chat? We'll be around here. Go ahead, Ben. Yep.
I had some fun commentary because Chris gave a Laravel talk. So I was having a Twitter conversation this week with Nick Rosenthal and Eric Barnes. And they were talking about the time I came to Atlanta PHP and Eric came down too. And I get to talk on Laravel for free. And there's still a video out there from Atlanta PHP user group. And I look like a child.
We all did. Yep.
Nice. Yep.
Yeah. Ben, you might have, if you weren't the first recording we did, you might have been really close. I can't remember if it was somebody before you. I have to double check.
I guess they're all still on Vimeo.
Yeah, they're all atlantaphp.org/video. And let's see.
11 years ago.
Oh, you were the second one, Intro to Laravel, June 7, 2012. Yeah.
Nice. 2012. 10, 11. Wait, what year is it? 11 years ago?
Yeah.
Yep. That September was the same. That was the same year we had what I called our 100-month anniversary. It was our 100th meetup for the group. I haven't kept up with what it is now. I don't know. We probably crossed 200 by now, but maybe not. It might be close. I don't know. I'll have to count them up again. But
New parents, you start out saying, "Oh, my kid is like 3 days old, 2 weeks old, 17 months."
yeah.
They're in school.
I've been doing this way too long point. That's as I described it. I've been took over a lead of the group since 2010. So it's the longest thing I've ever done in my life, pretty much here. But anyway, sidebar to all this.
I think Atlanta, your 20th anniversary for Atlanta PHP was last year, right? I think Boston and Dallas.
We're not quite 20 yet.
Okay.
We called our first official meeting. Pretty sure we said March 2004.
Okay. Next year.
So yeah, it's crazy.
Before that was, let's math real quick. I believe that was the year before I graduated high school.
Nice. Yep. These meetup groups have been around a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was trying to remember we talked at one point, I don't know, was it like a Lone Star or something, trying to figure out like what groups have been around that long. I don't know, like Boston, I think Dallas PHP maybe has been longer. New York PHP, certainly, because we were kind of modeled, when Ben Ramsey started up the group, he and Matt Kern, we're talking to New York people and modeling kind of after what things they had done and things they had found successful or not. So I feel like Atlanta is probably in the top 5 or 7 oldest, maybe ones we don't know about, but it's been a long run for sure.
I used to open the Austin PHP meetups as the longest running tech group in Austin. It's like I'm hoping somebody would correct me, but eventually you just keep on saying it, and then, well, okay, it must be true. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
Figure we can close this out.
Yep. Sounds good. Thanks for joining us, everybody, for May 2023. And come join us next month for Israel's talk in June. So thank you all for joining us. Have a good rest of your May. And hopefully it's not too hot where you are. All right. Bye, everybody.
Yeah.